So we find ourselves on this rather minimalistic screen, but going over it a bit, how it's an example of this sort of combination. The idea being, like, if we last time kind of explored a bit this sort of, um, let's say, the range of possibilities in this card idea, leading to, for example, this creation, which I think in explorations in terms of the potential was, I think, useful. I started to think, okay, if we kind of, um, you could say move forward or move up a bit, but I guess forward in a way, like then you could start to think like, okay, if these cards have this potential, what kind of combinations one could create from them that are kind of like almost like fragments of interactions you could see like inside a game, like or inside an organization, like that there is this thing that is like a small little organ that creates some things, and then you could combine these organs to create an organization, to finally use that metaphor, which really I've never used the organization in this context. So and um, and this is not to say that there wouldn't be this sort of whole creative potential to the cards that we have been looking at. It's more looking at a kind of simple case to start off with, to put the focus and emphasis more on the combination. But I'll walk through this. It's short, so I shouldn't go too long on this. So, like, we have the scene, which is just conversation like this. Could be something else, but like I thought that could be the scene. Inside the scene, there are two cards. One is a role of organizer. I probably could have come up with a more spiffy name, but that's now what it is, which means that everybody can take this role of the organizer. And the organizer can frame two cards from the conversation, the scene we are in. Um, um, then there is this, that they can propose the right of framing an additional card to another organizer, and if another organizer supports this proposal, the additional card is granted. That's kind of maybe too complicated, but what it essentially means that, like, originally you can make two cards, but somebody might propose you can make an additional one, and if others support it, you get like an extra token of making a card, essentially. But um, and then the organizer is encouraged to speculate upon the relations of the evolving cards, the cards that they're framing. And such speculations can be expressed onto the scene freely, which means the conversation and also this visual representation of empty space for the conversation. But okay, that's very simple in itself, and doesn't, like, it seems like a piece missing another piece, which is kind of the idea of the combination. And the other piece here is the definition of the card for the scene. So the card that you create by framing the conversation, somebody says an interesting sentence, you say, okay, I'll frame that as a card, and then as a seed for that card, you put like that sentence in. But at the same time, you get the role of the editor. Um, and inside this card that you have created. And what the editor can do is, well, first of all, they frame this, like, this, say, a phrase that somebody has said, and put that into the card as like a seed of where it's being born from. But beyond that, they can ask from others suggestions of how to develop this card. Say, for example, somebody has framed a card called anomaly mining, and there's just a phrase anomaly mining in the card so far, and the one who framed it now became the editor. Therefore, they have the right to ask from others, like, developments for the card, like what else could be there, should there be a description, how would you describe this, and they can ask for specific suggestions, like, like would you describe this in this and that manner? And then they can edit the suggestions into the card. Um, Now notice that they kind of become a weird version that is not the author, that they actively kind of ask things that could be there and put them and edit them there, but they don't write their own sentences. So in a way, like they don't take over the creation of the card, but they become the editorial host of what's there. So which is a kind of an idea towards hello Martin. I will address your presence in a second, but now that I'm going through an explanation, I'll just finish it. So it's a kind of a take on this, that you showed interest to say create a card out of, say, anomaly mining, if it was mentioned in the conversation, and you become a host in the sense that it's not then a ground where you just define it. It's actually a ground where you actively ask for others of how it should be defined and maybe edit them together, and kind of engage in conversations of what should be there. So the cards become these places which you are hosting, but you're not kind of the author in a traditional sense. Now, if we think of this as a combination, the scene, how it potentially plays out, which of course we should test, but is this like that there is a conversation, from there people frame cards, those cards become like developing, evolving topics, but the evolution is not like everybody's doing them alone, but actually kind of using others to feed the evolution. And then there is this possibility to speculate that maybe this is connected to that, like this, and so on. So it's kind of like an engine, even though it's just a simple combination of parts. But then you can think of that engine as a way to come from conversation and end up with the result of these topics that have evolved as cards and then have speculated upon their connections. So in this sense, it's also like an engine, like a factory. It's producing something, and that's kind of why I picked this sort of minimalist example of this sort of combinations and building blocks, is because then you can think of that as a building block. Like, okay, if we need like this kind of a piece that can take, say, a conversation and produce these kind of things like cards out of it, we could put this block into a game or to our organization, and then it kind of potentially can produce that. Now we can see from play whether it works, but of course it can always be, made different, made better, or modified. But at least it has the idea of this sort of a building block that is like an organ in an organization, or a modular mechanic in a game. Was that clear? And hello, Martin, also. Welcome. You missed conversations on DAL-E 2 and Kefir, which is a lot, but that's what happens when you miss our transitions.
Yes, hello. Also, I will also need to jump off because I'm actually in the car now. I just
That's
wanted
okay.
to say hi and get a bit of a flavor of where you guys are. I will. So this is just, as we say in German, Stippvisite. I don't know
Okay.
if Pablo's German is already so schooled, or yours still. But yeah, I just wanted to have a look and see you guys and say hi. And now I will have to jump off again.
Yeah,
Apologies.
it's okay. And if you can jump back at some point, that's very welcome. If you cannot, that's also all right. So
Okay.
yes,
Okay, super.
yeah.
Yeah. This is like Linda is just trying to kind of mend the gap between like digital backgrounds and that's the extent you're going to. Here's my other party here.
Oh yes.
Okay,
Hello
Dani,
to the other as well.
that's Olai. Olai is the name.
hello to the other Ola, or Ola that is the other. That's like,
Yeah,
because
that's
other Ola.
my better half for today.
Okay,
Okay, guys.
bye.
See you. Macca.
Bye. But yes, so but yeah, any questions, comments, whatever on that little
It
building block?
feels quite clear to me. I think I got it. Probably by playing it would be easier, but I feel
Yeah.
like I got it.
Yeah,
And I get the blocking, the fact of building blocks capacity. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we can definitely, and we should play it. And I think it is probably quite clear. And we can also, like, if it proves out that some part doesn't work, we can edit it on the fly, which I think benefits from it being quite simple, because then it's easier to edit and so on. Like, but yeah, like that's kind of the aim, clarity, whether that's successful or not.
I agree. Let's play.
Yeah, that's right. So the medium is conversation. We can, of course, modify what the conversation is however we want it. We can also add, like, to style the conversation if we want, but to put it simply, that. But like, because it's a free topic, we can kind of, for example, introduce questions like interesting organizational fragment seeds that we have produced that could be a topic to converse, which might lead to kind of possibilities to frame a card. But in any interest in a particular way of topicalizing or directing the conversation.
Maybe we can continue where we left off.
Yes.
In the transition.
Sure.
Yeah, like I'm thinking of the maybe this is already a card, but the kefir hacking, and sort of like how you can infuse yogurt or create yogurt with a specific bacteria of a specific cheese, and it retains some of the qualities, but also becomes yogurt and belongs to the broader group of kefir yogurt fermented milk. Is there an analogy we can build with organizations?
Well, yeah, the coexistence of bacteria as well. So that, yeah, healthy coexistence of bacteria.
Yeah, and also, like, I think it points out towards like how a context like a card or whatever could be ecosystemic, more like a biome in nature. And that, I think, is interesting in itself. Like, what does it mean? I think it has kind of its own life, or it can evolve, however that happens. But that's a possibility to think from there. And maybe just for the sake of an example, I could frame a card from there. I'll do it just as text first. I could put a card around it, but I'll do it in a second. Or maybe I'm actually waiting. It's an interesting, like, waiting for the right phrases. Because now I would maybe put like okay, card as an ecosystem. I might discard this card later, but just for the sake of example, I'll put this up as an example. And this would be merely a kind of a start of its evolution, like the framing that starts it. But so it's not much yet, but it's there. That you say?
Yeah, that I'm interested. Maybe this is a different card, or could be an addition to this card. But how the ecosystem grows from a sample, like how a small sample of something that's larger makes a specific flavor of yogurt in this case. Like what if we would take a small sample of an organization, or maybe even something smaller, like a process within that organization or a game mechanic, and then yogurtify it into yeah, what would it grow out of a small sample?
Now, you're completely free to create your own card. I think actually the more we create edit, the better, because it's kind of playtesting it. But I will also edit something in of what you said, because that's kind of my role now as an editor of this card. But this is not meant to override your card creation. More just catalyze this process. Now I have to fight a bit with Miro because it's being annoying. Thank you. Now can I edit it? Why are you? Okay, finally. And what I wanted to add from what you said is how does it grow, evolve? This is my editorial freedom of adding the word evolve there. Yeah, I think the question of like growth and evolution and kind of ecosystem like behavior is interesting. It's kind of like there is this sort of alienness is a strong word. Like I'm not meaning in a hostile manner, but alienness in this, that it takes a little bit of like a mind shift to starting to think about it. Like how do you build such things that evolve and are. But I would give one example, and that example would be the thing we're in is a kind of form of evolution. Like it's kind of feeding. It's like if bacteria is eating sugar, or milk, or lactose, or fat from milk, or whatever. This is eating the conversation, and the bacteria here are the cards. That they come to being out of eating that conversation, just like the sugar, and then start to grow their own uh, organs in a way. And I don't think it's the only way of looking at it, but it's kind of interesting way of looking at it. That these little cards that we have created now are kind of like little bacterial beings.
And you mentioned that you have to leave it in a warm place, right?
Yeah.
So there's also like specific scene that fosters or helps, aids in the proper production of ecosystem. So I think that's interesting as well. How can we frame that?
Yeah, it's actually I want to I'll edit it into fostering a medium. Like it's essentially using what you said, but I'm changing one word. The medium. And I would say here, to use this particular case as an example, this conversation we're having, that's kind of the medium now, or at least part of the medium. And way to foster it is somehow to affect the conversation. That's one way to address it. It's like maybe that's guiding the conversation of how the conversation, how it's happening. The conversation itself affects how much these beings can eat from it, meaning these cards, which is kind of, like I said, it's not the only metaphor, but it's kind of interesting way of thinking about it.
Is there like, can you overdo it? If you leave it for too long, does it go bad?
Mm, I mean, depending on the case, usually it kind of dies. Because if it's a closed ecosystem, like here's the difference between the conversation and so because you're feeding it milk, but then it eats the milk sugars, lactose, and fat from that milk. But when it's over, it doesn't have anything to eat, so then the bacteria will start dying off. And that's the idea in most of the kind of fermentation processes, why you're kind of putting it somewhere else, like you put your kombucha in another bottle, but then you feed more sugar water to keeping it going. So if the medium kind of dies from its richness, then the bacteria will die off. But
How
if
do you know that they die, that they are dead?
well, that's a good question. Like it depends on the case. I think it's mostly it dries up, like and it's it there's many ways, but like essentially if it turns into this sort of dried medium. But
So
bacteria
through
are
observation, sort of.
yeah,
It's
observation.
not that you try it.
Yeah,
Okay.
like I'll edit from there feeding the fostering the medium is feeding um, and that's also ingredients that are fed. Which was sort of mentioned. Like I know that I kind of made the word ingredients as a summary of some of the things said, but still in the realm of editing. I think, but yeah, I think this sort of. So I'll pose a question. This is me also feeding the medium of the conversation. If these things, these cards would behave like this bacteria, they are kind of evolving by the fact that they're being added things. It's very simple evolution, but still. What would make them better in their like inner structure of what's in the cards to behave more like their own ecosystems, behave more like bacteria?
Maybe some environmental influences.
Mm-hmm. Could be the environment, and could be also what's in their operation.
Yeah.
Like if there would be this sort of I mean, currently there's maybe an unsaid way of how I'm operating this particular bacteria, which is like listening in as the editor for things of interest and relation to this thing, and then inserting those things into it. That's kind of what I'm doing, which is probably not enough, but it's a start of evolution. But there is probably other ways of it to function.
Some operation, like in the form of the card having some process that gives it agency, that maybe we don't control everything about the card, but the card has some intentionality or direction, or it aims towards something on its own.
I will edit this in.
Like cards with a mission.
Giving the card agency. And I put it still as a question because it's something to be figured out. How do you give it agency? Like in a way, like one way to give agency is that like there is this person that has a role into the card, like now the editor, like who is kind of the host of the card, which becomes like the agency for the card itself. like, or helps the card to be agency. Like currently, as an editor, I'm an agency for this card because I'm formulating this possibility of or listening in to things that could relate to that, like and putting them in. But like ultimately, it could also have agency of its own, like um, uh, like in if it would kind of to behave more filter-like, which is not it's not yet. And then it actually has the possibility of taking things in. And if it would be a filter that is affected by the things that it's filtering, that it changes by the nature of what it's filtering, then it would have, like, in a way, agency, like, or it would look like an agency, like in a manner of evolution.
Sorry, guys, then it's 5 already. I need to go, but I will watch the recording. This was
Okay.
exciting. Sorry to interrupt.
Yep.
Ciao, ciao.
So
I'm thinking of like fermentation as a process of fermentation, like it wants to grow, it wants to keep eating, keep growing out of the sugars or whatever. So maybe there's like an adversarial process where someone plays the role of trying to grow and grow and grow, and someone has to decide where that process should be stopped for the card to be frozen, consumed. Yeah, something like that.
mm-hmm. So you could have like I mean, essentially, it's kind of putting like if inside a card there would be whether it's roles or, well, the roles bring in this sort of ops, whether they're rights or whatever with them. Like you could have a card that has a role of um, like somebody who is the feeding agent that feeds things into it,
Mm-hmm.
and then there would be another role. Now there's like two roles in the card and likely two persons in it. And the other person would be, for example, a filter. Of course, the relations could be something else.
Mm-hmm.
But now that becomes ecosystem of its own. Uh, or yeah, it's also like it. You could take it from there to the direction that both that it's kind of feeding into itself, but it also could feed into new cards that are kind of part of its suite or family. So, for example, like if there would be a card of uh, I think it's fine to edit one's own comment. Let's put like a yes, I'll to like row feeder with a question mark plus row filter, and this is just the start of things, but to point that out, and then maybe as a question, is the ecosystem of this the generation of other cards, which is kind of yes, I'm editing what I said, but I think it's still within the rules. Like um, So
Yeah, tell me, tell me.
I was laughing at your original cheese fragment.
Because I'm thinking there's like a starting point
Mhm.
for the feeding, like in your experiments, like you take a piece of cheddar or a piece of Roquefort or whatever. So that is the original cheese fragment that starts the process, that is put on by the filterer, actually, maybe.
Mm.
And then the bacteria does its processing, which is more like, I imagine if we would do this now, like maybe
Mm.
you give me a fragment of something
Mm.
and I just riff on it without much thought. Like maybe it's not a very sophisticated process, but I just like talk about it. And then it sort of grows, 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 grows. And then you can decide what to take out of it.
Yeah, it could be like, yeah, let's see, like that as a structure is like I give you the original seed and then you grow on it. That's a possible structure. There's also a possibility that, you know, like you or I form a filter, which is kind of like the original cheese fragment, which could be this sort of mechanism that I approach it in a certain way, and the other one feeds it, like for example, talking to it or talking about it, um, or even both feed it, like, and then, um, but say if you're holding the filter, then you keep on filtering from it. That's like both are possible, like just as these sort of different forms of interaction. Um, um, I think this kind of form also could um, uh, benefit from, like, okay, like let's say there existed cards beforehand which are kind of like these filters, and you could bring these filters in, like those were designed already, and you could kind of select which kind of filters you bring, and those become kind of ways to filter in the condensation. That's also a possibility in itself.
I'm diagramming this because there's also, I know when you're making cheese, not sure when you're making yogurt, but there is actually a process of filtering. Like there's a remnants of the liquid, the water that is left, and then the milk that got turned into cheese. So I'm thinking if maybe I'm taking it too far with the cheese analogies, but I see some potential here.
I think it's always good to explore it. It's like it can work as long as it works, like it, and it might very well work. Like I think this sort of, yeah, filtering, because it is actually present in all these kind of processes. In cheese, it's kind of like um, it's condensation filtering.
Mm.
Um, is that you get rid of the some parts, and like for example, let's say I would grow this card that I'm keeping on growing, and it probably grows quite large if I keep on growing it. But at some point, I would run it through a condensation filter, which would be essentially as an editor cutting off, like maybe most of the parts and leaving just certain parts. So that could work. Mm, I'll put it as a question. No, not that. Um, condense in, yes, something like this. The final card. What is the final card?
The final card is what comes out of the filter.
Mm. Yeah, this, uh, or it could be an outcome card. Like somebody could even continue
Yeah.
the process from there. Like one could take the condensed version and evolve from there.
Absolutely, yeah. I
Uh,
would call it condensed result, which could be a card.
because I can kind of see it like that there is some sense to this process, like looking at this engine we started. What is telling me, like, if I'm filtering from the conversation, what is likely that there is interesting stuff, but there probably is more stuff than um, like not all of it will be interesting. Like it will fill up with stuff that you would like to condense or filter off to make it into a card. So then having that kind of a phase in it kind of makes sense to actually make it into a functioning form. And then that can be an outcome card, but like it can also continue its evolution, like in a way that that outcome is useful and can be kind of cut off and frozen like a piece of cheese. Or like you do in, say, kefir is like, or kombucha is you pour over off certain part and put it in a fridge, but then the other part continues to make more kefir.
Yeah. And you can always use that as a new cheese fragment.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's a bit like with sourdough. No, you have to keep a bit to
Yeah,
keep making more.
it's
And if you
the
use
same
it,
structure. Yeah.
you lose it, right? Like it's you have to keep a fragment alive that you don't use. I think that's interesting. Like there's a part of the fundamental part of the process that you keep as sacred and don't turn into a card maybe or something like that.
But there is an interesting digital version of fermentation here is combining two mediums, is that you can copy that. Like in a way you can keep the root, like you make an interesting card and then you copy that card to be part of a deck, so to speak, and then it's there, but then the other copy stays as a root and you start the fermentation on that card again and it kind of evolves further. So this is kind of a digital fermentation.
It's a non-rivalrous cheese factory.
Yes, yes. But it kind of makes sense, like in a way, like that's the kind of extra you get in digital, even if you follow this sort of evolution or um, what is like a metabolistic process. I'm missing a word here. Like anyway, that kind of a thing.
I don't know how to write rivalrous. No.
I think it might be right.
No, it's not.
It might be because it's not a normal.
Yeah.
Because you might sometimes get right words, yet the.
Yeah,
it's
actually,
not right.
I think it's okay.
Yeah.
Rivalrous, yeah.
Yeah, because it's not rivalric, that I know. Like, so then it's probably rivalrous. Unless it's rivalos.
No, I think it's okay. I
Yeah,
searched
yeah.
for it.
So, so like in a way, like one possibility here is also, like I was thinking actually making a card out of some things, these speculative relations you've made now, and make it into a card, which is kind of possible. Let me see. How do I make this? So if I do this and this and this, am I having all the elements? No, I'm still missing elements. The thing is with when you're inside a box, Miro starts to break down in the sense that it's hard to select things. So I have to do this little bit handiwork. Okay, let's see if I have this and I copy that what do I get? I got the whole structure, okay?
Nice.
And then I'll move it. For practical sake, I'll just move it on the side. Well, I can move it here because we can extend the card. And then what I'll do is to make this thing even more complicated from Miro. Is I put a card around it. So, like, now this could be a point of evolution in itself. And like, in a way, like, you use this kind of process, which is kind of like a model. It's like I said, the scene could be a conversation here. Like, that's the environment for growth. That's the medium. That's the milk. That's the sugar border. Could be something else as well. Could be some other process than conversation. And then there are these different filters. Maybe one filter, maybe many. Maybe I'll this days. Oops. What I wanted to do is to do a little bit of editing, but now Miro is slightly. Oh yeah, this is what I should do. All right, so I'll put like so, like potentially filters, and those are used to create condensed results. Which then can become original cheese fragments.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential in each one of these elements to be considered a slot that can, in different circumstances, serve different purposes. Like, as you said, the scene can be a conversation, but maybe it's a game. The original cheese can be an idea, but maybe it can be a saved file.
Yes.
Like everything could be like a possible slot.
Yeah, like what is the scene? What is the filter? What is, like, yes, it's in this sense it's a slot-like structure. So let's actually edit that. I'll put that's the title, and then I'll make this simple for now. Which is not maybe the best way to describe it, but it's a way to just add with slots into the title. So this is now in a way like it's a card out of this conversation, because in a weird way, like that was kind of at least part of the idea was this sort of like the scene is the conversation, but the scene is also this board that we are on, like that they are kind of connected to each other. So in a way that it's extracting from the board is part of extracting from the medium. I'll also edit that I call this scene and I'll say that it's a living.
Yeah, that's important.
A living or rich. What would be a better word for rich, or nutritious?
Nutritious, yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, there's some important words here, like metabolism. I think that's important in this card. Nutritious, living. There should be some reference to fermentation.
Um, uh, so fermentation is essentially, I think it actually, it might be good to move towards like from fermentation to what's actually happening, because fermentation is merely like introducing the right bacterial culture, like the right filters, the right operators into uh, this rich, nutritious environment in order that they transform it, but also kind of form out of it the units, the bacteria that live there. So in a way, like fermentation is almost like more general, and
Yeah, true.
and we moved like less general from it. We moved more to the specifics. That and you introduce them to produce another thing out of it, like a fermented cucumber becomes a pickle, which is it's still like a cucumber but different, and fermented cabbage becomes kimchi or sauerkraut, which is still starting from the same but different. Yeah, so in the like feeding into the medium, which is this conversation, like, so what do you think, what kind of directions one could take this kind of structure or other structures mentioned so far?
I find this card making process was successful. Like we the original scene conversation producing a card, I think that came out okay. Maybe we can either play this card into action or play another card into existence. I would be afraid to overdo this card.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I think like in a way, like it can always continue its evolution, but like one could also take it elsewhere or play it elsewhere, essentially. So okay, the one way to play this, let's see if I can. Yeah, now the selection works. There was maybe some bugs in Euro earlier.
I locked the card behind, like the giant card we are in.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that was, it wasn't behind. That was the thing. Yeah. Now if I copy this, yes, it works. So now, as an experiment, what I'm doing is, let's see if this works. Yes, also this works if these are selected. I played this as a scene. So now on the side, there's a larger version of this card as a scene. And I'll meaning it's like the board of a board game. I mean, this is one possibility. I'm not saying we have to do that, but this is one possibility. Now that it's the board, it becomes this new question of, okay, what do we, for example, what do we place on the slots? What kind of medium? What kind of filters? And I don't think you have to fill all the slots. That's maybe enough. Like,
I'm thinking I will start with the fragment. And just to have continuity with last session, maybe we left off at masks last time. So the original cheese is masks.
Yes.
I bring this from last session.
Yes. And then the scene could be, yeah, I think your editing style is, it's a scene within a scene, but this is fine. Like it's like they all have recursive qualities. And this could be, like, one possibility is to make the whole board let's put like just like this can change. I'm not saying this has to stay. This board, meaning that and the process around it. So now it's kind of still contains the conversation, but it's more the emphasis is also on the visuals. So that's and then the filters. That's another slot I would fill. Like what kind of like one could be like one easy could be like a suggestions or fragments of potential masks. Like it's the filters would kind of take fragments of masks. Once again, we can edit, but I'll just add. Let's see if this works. I put it on a. And then I'll make it smaller. So, because there could be other filters, so I make them as a list. So other filters can be added. So, like if I look at this board now as in terms of what are fragments of masks, like one thing that opens up is like, not sure if that direction works, but came to my mind is like for example, what would be, I'll put it here, what would be a condenser? And for simplicity's sake, I don't do it with the borders because it's faster to make. I put it with the question mark.
Condenser mask.
That I mean, there could be many condensers in itself. Like you could, or if another way to play this board, I'm playing also by looking at the earlier cases, fragments of masks. Maybe I'll make a copy of, let's say, this one, this image, and then bring that as a question mark. That's not the condenser mask, that's another candidate. So consider that as a question mark. So this is what I'm filtering out now. I'm just playing around with this idea, is that I'm looking at the whole board. I mean, like there's much stuff there, but like looking at the surroundings and filtering them towards fragments of masks. And then the fragments is a very kind of open term here. It's like in the case of condenser mask, it's just the idea. Then in the case of maybe these images, there are some suggestions maybe how these masks could be masks, but like how to use them is still an open question.
Yeah, I'm thinking, I don't know if we talked about this last time, but one interesting thing about masks is that they are modifiers acting at the level of identity. So I'm thinking identity could be part of the condensed result, like how like the process of masks creating a persona inside of the scene, and then after some filtering there's like a modification of that identity that is resulted.
Yeah,
I don't know how to
and
incorporate that.
I think like it's what a mask is like actually this is material. Like a mask is filter of an identity potentially in two directions, and like you can think of the mask as a way of filtering towards the inward, like you become a different person because of the mask, but it's also towards the outward, is that you are read differently as a person because of the mask. And I put this as material here.
I put
Actually,
it in the filter, but maybe that's not a good place. But yeah, inward mask, outward mask, that is really, yeah, that is very powerful. Sometimes you hide behind the mask, and sometimes the mask amplifies something that is yours.
Yeah.
But yeah, but there's always like a multiplying effect, or I don't know how to refer to it, but it's augmented in one way or another, either by making you more anonymous, more stealth, less visible, or making you more visible. I guess you can also have a mask that just pretends to be someone else without more level of augmentation or less level of, just like an anonymizing mask.
Yeah.
I guess those are the 3 levels of masks.
Yeah, it's so, but yeah, it can increase. I'm actually kind of adding to the definition of the mask as material, like let's put increasing or decreasing. Okay. Such as notability, noticeability. That's an example of it. So, okay, let's see. We are clearly in a kind of machine, an engine, and we are kind of at the same time constructing the engine. And like in this kind of operating mode, what is interesting is to keep this, I guess this is a filter, by the way, as well, like way an eye on like what is the machine producing. What I noticed that one thing that it's producing now is it's increasing the definition of the nature of the mask. And that's one thing that is kind of being produced here. So like my filter currently is like a mask definer. Maybe I'll put it just to remember it. It's like a definer as a thing. And then the definer is what I'm currently producing is this sort of additions from the conversation to the definition of the mask. And why I think it's interesting to look at these kind of things, it's also like thinking of what one is producing with the engine and what kind of possibilities open from there.
Yeah, I think this was like we further investigated the mask. We put the mask in the how did we call it? In the medium for growth, and now mask is growing, but it's also like we're extracting condensed results out of the mask conversation.
I think the growth is like just the whole process. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Like that's the growth. and then these things that are being kind of written or drawn out of it are the extracted things. Yeah. How, like in here, if one would develop this sort of, let's say, navigational or operational skills, like how to operate the engine kind of skills, is to kind of well, develop this sort of awareness and ways to modify how the machine is operating, which is kind of interesting in itself, like as an operating mode. Like, because like looking at from the overview, there's this interesting way of operating here. It's like it's clear that one can start this process of that is aimed towards this sort of like, let's insert the original seed germ fragment, like here in this case it was the masks. Let's turn it into a process, and here of course it wasn't only the scene, but it's the condensation, but that's kind of mentioned there. It's the board and the process around it. And then there were these filters, and some of the filters were actually kind of generated on the spot. Like I didn't think of the definer beforehand, but then you brought the definition, and that became like, oh, that's a place where I could put it. Like, oh, you said something interesting, I could put this in somewhere. That definition there is a place where I could put it, where it kind of fits, and then extracted it and put it there. So that's kind of the filtering thing in itself. Now, what is not maybe happening, or is kind of like on the still on the kind of unclear side, is like condensing things out of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess this chart that I made here could be a condensation, but it might lack connection to, or direct connection to the rest of the condensed results, but just like this mask spectrum as a modifier of identity that goes from the anonymity to the augmentation. And right in the middle, if it's not making you more anonymous, or if it's not augmenting something of your identity, it might just allow you to present yourself as someone else.
Yeah. Pseudo.
Like I'm imagining pseudonymity would be like those hyper realistic human looking faces that I don't know, people would use in spy movies.
Yeah. And that is a kind of condensation / extraction. I don't think it's a problem that sometimes things are a little bit of a condensation and a little bit of an extraction, because kind of that's natural, I think, and that there's qualities of that. But yeah, one could say that this is potential condensation of it. Like, I think one of the key questions could be like, well, there's several, but one is like, of course, like in a way, like thinking of this as a condensation, like it's in itself a useful thing. Like you could use this spectrum somewhere. Like you now, like it condenses, well, not just an idea, but a kind of like a structure, I guess is a good word for it. And then that in itself is potentially useful elsewhere. But then another thing is operability. Is like, could it be like a card like in itself that you could operate upon it? Like, and for that, like, I don't think everything has to be actively operable. There's also this possibility that you can operate something by like it's like a tool. You think where you could use it. Like it's a structure, then you think, what could I do with this structure? So, for example, one could place that question: what could I do with the structure to your graph? I guess one could call it.
Yeah, how can it become operational?
Yeah. But the operational can be in the sense like it's a machine itself, like I can use it, or it can be operational in the sense that I could put it somewhere. It's just like I make an operation where I use this, and both are kind of operation. But I guess they both kind of condense into the question of how could I use it? Like
I'm
I
in the world of stealth masks. This is really interesting.
I use it actually to open up a question. This is just interesting. It's a weird word, so I have to put it in quotation marks. Maybe I'll make it so that I'll make this into. So what came to my mind is I'm now using your structure to make this query of other nimities, which is a really bad term for, like, okay, we talk about anonymity, and an identity kind of belongs to the same, and then there's pseudonymity. Well, there's this augmentation as well, but are there nimities that we haven't thought of beforehand?
Yeah, like expanding the dimensionality of this spectrum.
Yes.
Mhm.
So, and it doesn't even have to kind of be forced back into it, but it's reusing that as a machine to maybe create, maybe even for some other context, like other nimities. And I'll put as a question mark, like, let's put, what is the, I'll use this weird word now. There probably would be a better word for this, but um, uh, what is the limit of profession? And what I mean by this is like, okay, so somebody is, I don't know, a blacksmith, and that is a kind of a mask, and it's even communicated by the fact that there's often a costume that goes along with that. And I could say the same of almost any vocation, profession in this sense. But what is the style of nimity that they have? Because it's a kind of a nimity mask likeness. But is it like, is it
Like,
pseudonymity?
do you mean like extracting an essence of a profession that can be expressed in a wearable mask, something like that?
No, I mean like the style of nimity um, uh, that is in like somebody being a blacksmith. What kind of nimity it is?
I guess it's pseudonymity, or
Yeah,
I guess, yeah, or I don't know what's the word, but that you have sort of different personas, and one of them is your private persona, one of them is your professional persona.
mm.
So I guess it is a form of not necessarily pseudonymity, but I don't know what the word is.
Okay, so there is like I think there maybe there is another spectrum. Like anonymity, pseudonymity is forming this sort of they're both covering something of your identity. How do you think of the augmentation? Like, what's your sense of it?
I'm thinking augmentation as probably it points towards a certain feature and makes it louder. For example, in the mask right here, sort of like there's a certain malicious playfulness that is exaggerated. It's a process of exaggeration.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So it's also a kind of intensifier. I think there is a word which doesn't come to my mind now, but like that is precisely this kind of quality, like intensifier. But it doesn't matter. It's so okay.
Maybe
So
amplification.
yeah, amplification. Yeah. Yeah. So it's.
Yeah.
And one can think of amplification also in the sense of kind of the negative of it. Like I think it's fine to think of like so then that opens up like these questions of is there okay, I'll add if the, I'll write it down. If there is amplification, is there translation? And I had another translation or I'll put it in when I remember it. But like translation is one. Like I guess actually that is in some ways a pseudonym. Like
Translation as pseudonymity.
like in a way, like if you think of like the pseudonym becomes a thing of its own, so it's translating you to another identity. Like pseudonym becomes an identity of its own, and when you're working under the pseudonym starts to gather its own identity. So you're using it like, well, it's not quite the same thing, but it's sort of like there's some qualities that are like that, but also a translator is different. Yeah, it's weird. Like it's an interesting area overall, like to think like what like because there is also like okay, one example of like a translation coming from this profession side is like if you take a pen, that is sort of a translation. That let's say if you take a pen and make a drawing, then the pen is the translator, and then that's an expression of your identity translated by the pen into a drawing.
Yeah, it's also a process of registry, or leaving registration is not the word, leaving a mark.
Yeah, but a particular kind of mark, because if
Yes.
you would take a brush, then the brush would be a translator leaving a painting.
There's some fingerprinting.
Yeah, but in the style given by the translator.
Yes, there's it is closely related to the one who utilizes the tool.
Yeah.
And I'm also thinking now of how certain masks operate in culture. Like I'm thinking of superhero masks have both features of amplification and anonymity, whereas something like the V for Vendetta mask has both pseudonymity and anonymity, processes.
Yeah,
So it's yeah, I don't know, like that's interesting in terms of masks operating in popular culture.
I think one could put this, I'll put this in the query as the topic of, I'll still use these horrible words, group nimity, and what is the other, group nimity and type nimity. One has to probably make this more normal, but I mean by, so the reformatted the mask is group nimity, because it's kind of making them it's making them more a group than anonymous completely. Like it's actually group nimity more precisely than anonymous.
Yeah, that's
It's
a good
because
word.
yeah, and it's also type nimity in the sense that if that group becomes a type of things, like a certain type that is recognized by society, then it's a type nimity. Which, yeah. So like I said, the words are not the best, but I think the idea is there. Like you become a category, essentially. Like you take your identity from a category. You become a categorical identity. If that makes sense.
Yes, and there's a process of like I think what you're talking about is a process of anonymity that derives from collective pseudonymity, something like that.
Yeah. Um, uh, yeah, it's collective. Like if it's a group, yeah, it's collective. Um, so yes, your identity can be a category, which is also like in a different version, a kind of a profession is an example of this as well, like blacksmith. Again, like that's a category, and so is graphic designer or things like this. Okay, so I think this is also a learning experiment to be in this sort of engines organs.
Yeah, the
How?
mask typology
Yeah,
engine.
yeah. So this is now my typology engine. Now I thought about, okay, this is now an engine. It's creating mask typology. So how can one use this engine? Is, for example, if one was creating masks in this wider sense that we were doing, say, towards the end of the last session, then you could bring this mask typology engine to consider the possibilities. Like it could open up, okay, what if this particular mask is a group unity? What kind of a group it would form? What kind of collective it would form?
Yeah, the purpose of the mask can be defined with these terms.
Yeah, because like if there was a definer mask, what would be the definers in the sense of we forwarded the group?
Yeah.
Like a social group, or yeah, and then you can start thinking of there like what kind of group it would form, and like you can see these visions of people going and defining things in the or condenser, which would go and kind of take large realms of data and then just condense them. And of course, that would bring other behaviors. Maybe the condensers have certain ways of expression or mediums where they put things. And those are just like off the cuff examples because they happen to be close by to illustrate this possibility of using this engine. But also, a definer could work at the same time as a pseudonym. An example of this, like let's say there is this category of definers, and let's not go as far as the V4 vendetta style that there is this whole culture of the definers or whatever, but rather somebody creates this definer identity and you write an article under the pseudonym of definer, which somebody else might do as well, which kind of points to this group collective identity, but it's also like it could function as a pseudonym.
I'm also thinking of the word synonymity. as in a synonym,
Mhm.
and maybe the antonymity, could
Yeah,
that be turned into a mask? Could that be put into the mask
it's a
engine?
contrast.
Yeah, it's a contrast.
Actually, contrast. I'll just put it somewhere. Um, uh, where is my text tool there? Like these are not the best placing, and these are not the best terms. Contraster. I'll put it somewhere. Like, let's put them here because they're separate from that graph. So contraster mask. Um, um, that could be essentially facing something, they would turn it into contrast of it. And of course, I think it's maybe useful that it's kind of contrast is kind of open for expression. Like you can make a contrast in many ways. Like there's no absolute, it's always this contrast. Like for example, a contrast of a teddy bear might be concentrating on softness and turn that to a hardness or something else. But that could be a contrast. So that's sort of antonymic, kind of.
Yeah, I see that.
But also, like, there's another direction because you were connecting the group grouponymity to synonymity, which is a good connection. I think it's true. Like, there is a, like, people are a collective identity. They are in a synonymous relation with each other because they're not quite the same, but they are similar and they're
Yeah.
defined by their synonymity. So that fits quite well. So, but an antonymous group would be weird because it would be like, well, one form would be dyads, pairings, which is like when there is somebody, you find the contrast to it and they form a dyad. Like in this sense, like night and day. And night and day form a group in itself in an antonymous relation to each other.
Yeah, like a group of contrasted dyads.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, I'll just put this anto thing. I mean, there might be other forms, but that certainly fits. So, and of course, from there you could make a mask that is antonymous that has like two sides, like night side and day side. That's a possibility to create from there.
There's also the tragedy and comedy masks.
Yes, yeah.
That's an antonymity mask dyad.
Yeah.
Very common in culture.
Yeah. Masks. Yeah, that's so. Once again, a kind of overview in this. So, okay, now we are still in this engine that is producing this variability around like different spectrums or dimensions for the mask. And the original engine was this anonymity, pseudonymity, amplification, which was expanded, and then there was this query inserted into the engine, which was othernimities, which then started producing this these things that have come out of it. Yes.
Do you think you can position the antonymity masks between the pseudonymity and the amplification? Kind of, right? Could be.
Maybe like above, between. Like I wouldn't place it directly between. I would place it like in the above, like in the, because like you have the synonymity on the other side. I mean, it's a sort of a symmetry. One can think whether it's a fitting symmetry, but it's a symmetry between the with the V for Vendetta mask. It's an interesting, like, it's also like creating this, how like diagram is a pseudo system anyway. I mean, it's certainly a system, like that's why flowcharts are system presentations in a diagrammatic format. But they also kind of like a board game is a diagram, but then there are added rules to play it to enhance the system-like nature of the diagram.
Yeah.
All right. So these open up this sort of possibilities to think about also how to play this. Like in a way, like you could take. Okay, so some from here, because I'm now condensing results, but so you could think like the one way one could describe what happened was that there was the scene / a board, which was this original graph, and then in the scene there was also, or at least added to it, was this query of other limites, which then generated a game or play that added to the machine and the definitions there.
Yeah, the nimities, I would say, was a very effective filter.
Yeah. And I think partly it was that because it's a kind of pseudo concept. Like you can understand what it is, but it's clearly a kind of, to be fancy about it, it's a kind of a catachresis, which is a concept perverted from its usage. But yeah, it's a catachresis. Not that one has to go fancy Greek about it, but anyway. And I'm not going to make a catachresis mask, no. But yeah, it's a. But hey, like in terms of this, yeah, this pulling results, like it's also pointing out how it's like to open up to it. There is this sort of like treating diagram as a scene of play in the terms of the scene, in the XORGian terms of the scene.
Yeah.
And then like treating like this possibility of adding other playing pieces, cards, which are still like layer filter like the query was clearly kind of placed like a layer filter, which then became a way to play the structure of the diagram. And I think that there's something there that is a good idea or good direction to take out of this, like, or like it's a like what it can enhance if one kind of develops that direction is it kind of opens up more possibilities of play on any given structure, like structure in the widest sense, including something like a diagram, but other structures as well, or on any given system.
Yeah, I mean, I have a natural tendency towards diagramming for understanding, but it could definitely be more playable, more played through.
Yeah. And I think that is an interesting direction. Like, because yes, it's true for diagramming, but I do think there is underneath that there is like, well, potentially any structure. It's not that you become equally skillful at playing with any structure. It's kind of probably like that if you take a different kind of structure, then it takes you a bit of learning to how to kind of accommodate to that structure. But on the other hand, if you would do it with many structures, then you would become like faster at doing it to new structure kind of thing, like normal kind of learning process behaviors.
Yeah. In this particular case, I guess as a form of final condensation, I think I think it was good to bring the masks from the previous session. That sort of like chaining through sessions is helpful, I believe.
Mm,
And that maybe we can feed back into the multi-masker card at some point.
yes, that could be possible. There is another, and this was kind of a point which I was thinking that maybe if things concretize, uh, one could point out, and I think it's possible in this case. Is like the more I've thought about this sort of organization, and also in the sense of an OXL, but organization in general, is that it is interesting to think about, like, how this itself, like this graph, uh, the graph and whatever it's written to it, is an organization in itself. Like, and there is something I think fruitful to that kind of thinking, and also like thinking of it in this sort of fractalic nature and kind of modular nature, that it's an organization in itself, but it can be part of an organization. But that organization can be, for example, where it could end up is like maybe it's in the same document with another structure, and then the organization is the document itself. But why that is fruitful is that it kind of brings to mind, okay, like how do I take part in this organization? It's not saying, oh, you're the reader. And then you ask, what does it mean? I'm the reader. Well, it means the usual thing, and that's kind of like poor. And like think of now if there was a document with these different structures, but it's just given, and then you are the quote unquote reader. But if it's more like an organization, it kind of opens up this question, okay, how do I take part in this? And then that opens up this sort of sense of a role and like operational styles and things like this, which of course can be part of the document itself, but it becomes a natural question to ask. I
Yeah,
don't,
go ahead.
no, I was just asking, does it make sense or?
Yeah, totally. Like I see how that's actually the how to say, like the power of play as an operation. It really implies a creative use of organizational structures. Whereas if you refer to them as an organization, you might approach it more bureaucratically. Once you know you can play it, you have like the you're giving the agency to perform it.
Yeah, there's like they both imply, the organization and play slash game imply this active role, um, but the play maybe opens up this active role a little bit. Like it kind of implies also the creativity in the active role. But this is why also I think it's already fruitful to think, like, say if you now imagine this document, say a book or whatever, of these kind of graphs, but then you say it's an organization, it already opens this, oh, I'm now actively present here, like I'm taking part in this organization rather than I'm reading it, is already opening the active role. But if you say it's a game and you are to play with it, it also opens the active role, but maybe with a little bit more creativity in itself. And I'm of course not saying that it should just stay there, that you just change the category from a document to organization or play, but rather that if you make that at the design spot, then you start thinking of, okay, what kind of, say, roles and operations I give in order for there to be play, in order for there to be participation in the
Yeah.
organization, however you want to think about it.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Like if we consider this from the since the inception, you can create these cards, let's say this document, with the intention of it being an organization or a game, and then maybe the reading process already implies some agency and creativity and organizatory energy into it. Like maybe you read the document already with a role.
Yeah, exactly. That's
Yeah.
and that role might come with operations where you change it, or like, yeah, just as a kind of practical or just one direction of a practical example is like, say this was approached in this manner. It's a game or organization, or really it's XORG, or it's a game organization. That's actually maybe the most fruitful of this all, which is not surprising. But anyway, so it's now a game organization. This document, like this graph plus this text, maybe a polished, but anyway, this roughly speaking, this. Like this could come on the side of it is like, oh, it's an organization. It's like, oh, how do you play this organization? Is that you make somebody into the role mask of synonymity, somebody the role mask of anonymity, anonymity, and so on. And then you start thinking of what kind of, say, moves those roles have, and then you might give a goal for this organization. It's like maybe it's like generating more nimities, or maybe it's something else. But just as an example. And that kind of works. It becomes a very weird organization, but it sort of is an organization.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes sense. That, I mean, it's the only thing that makes sense if we're gonna make a something, that something is already an organization and a game, and that the way you approach it has elements of both.
As a sort of a final or close to final addition, I'll make. I don't put it in your graph because it's messing up things. If I put it, I have to make this horrible word. Archifinimity, and then I pull an arrow from here, and it starts from, it should start from here and go here. Maybe I'll put it there, and maybe I'll put a question mark in it because it's certainly under a question mark. So and this came to my mind because I thought, like, okay, if I would play this organization, this XORG, where like, and it started being interesting, like somebody takes the mask role of synonymity and plays that, becomes an agent of that, and then I was thinking, but who's the Spider-Man? And then I thought, like, could name it, and then it would be like an archetype, archie, but then artificial archetype, because that's kind of what superheroes are.
Yeah.
They're kind of archetypal, but they're kind of very plasticky. Like you make this, so then it's artifi, and then nimity, and then that creates this interesting thought of why are they at the top, but it's but it's not a bad thought. Like it was an interesting thought. So yeah. But I think there's something hidden in that, like this thought of, okay, this is a playful organization, or can be, or this kind of approach, and these kind of engines are, or can be, playful organizations, because it kind of opens up this sort of organizational creation. Like this would be better or more playable if you had these definitions of, hey, here's one way to play it, like, okay, people take these roles of, like, the mask role, which is a concept for this organization, that's a mask role of anonymity. I don't know what the mask role combination does, but it's an interesting one, therefore that's it. And somebody takes the mask role of pseudonymity, and then maybe some other things, like goal of creating other nimities or some other goal. And if you would have that description, then you could kind of play that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like in general, I think, like to generalize this thought, the document we create, the cards we create, have to have this, the reading or the consumption of them has to be both an engine of further exploration of the game itself, like as long as in the way that you read it you also operate it.
Yeah, and one more thought, because like it often happens, we should be finishing, but there is some interesting thoughts coming at the end, is that, and I think it also illustrates why it's interesting to think about this game organization. It's like really opening the spectrum. It's like whatever are the conventions of a game are at one end, and whatever are the conventions of the organization are at one end. But the kind of most, in a way, playful range comes from the fact that you create this bridging concept that contains both. And to illustrate that, if this was a playful organization, you could take, say, people that decided for 2 days to be in this organization, this one, with the extra definitions, and start to operate through that. That would be quite interesting. Like, and of course, one could make something that is much more tailored towards that and make them more, say, useful. But it's just proving this power. Like, so if they would be just thinking of a game, they might play it like, it might be interesting. They play for maybe like to generate something. Maybe it's kind of a role-playing game, and that's sort of interesting, yes. But if it's like game organization, then there is like, we are kind of operating through it. So maybe we actually kind of create a document, and then we actually name this organization, and now it's published something, and then we go out of that organization, but it's still available for us. But that's an interesting way of creation that doesn't quite open just from the concept of the game, and it certainly doesn't open from a conventional sense of organization. But that possibility is, for me, actually something very key towards thinking organizations in the future. Is like you could take this form and operate through it, and that operation can produce something.
It's the production of voxels for
Yes,
further
yeah, exactly.
further use. Yeah.
Yeah, that's, and I think that's something to aim towards. I think like ultimately these tools, including the kind of analytics or structurings and expressions, like ultimately I think as a thematic direction, I think that's what they should illustrate, that this is possible, that you can, in a very much more wider way, organize yourself, and the usefulness of that, it creates creative engines in the sense of new socialities.
Absolutely, that should be written down.
Yeah,
Creative engines, new socialities.
yeah, yeah. Let's put that. You can write that. I'll write this.
In the ever present search for a XORGian definition.
I put some of the memento points of this last conversation towards this. That there was this. Benefit Yeah, it's usually useful to make this point still, because one might remember them, but okay, that's something.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
It could be said better, but at least it's good to put it. Like I think in this, like we wandered through a kind of weird forest of things, which is, I think, a common feature when you go outside of normal convention. It usually feels like a forest, like you're off the road, and it's kind of like everything is a bit weird and like a little bit awkward and so on. But then, like through like wandering off the road, you find things that are like probably waiting there just by the side, but just unnoticeable because you cannot really reach them just going on the road itself. So wandering in these engines and the kind of forest of process it creates, I think it leads to this kind of discoveries. But I do think like what it created is this sort of a sort of semi-tangible way of looking at it. That's sort of how it looks like. That's sort of the sense of it. It's not exactly that, but that's a form, an example of it. Like because now I can already see this weird wacky book. Like wouldn't make exactly that, but it's already an interesting image that it's a weird wacky book of organizations. And there might be a page like this with these extra pieces, but then it's saying it's an organization, and maybe there are these slots like give it a name, and here's how you operate it. But then it's really aimed not just for let's play it, but also like use it for collective creation, because you wouldn't create the same things without it. And that's the point.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
All right, I'll stop sharing now.
Yeah.
And thanks, and of course my camera has bugged itself out as usual. But I think like I think we found ourselves somewhere like in something quite interesting in terms of
Yes.
like goal points for all these structures. Like yeah, I think it's interesting to think about that, and maybe it can free up a bit like how the expression of these things is. Like these structures are very useful, like whether it's the types, the scenes, the layer filters, cards, in terms of navigating and having handholds in this weird space. But ultimately, like
Yeah.
like if you can still free up like how you can make this, like you don't have to follow these exact rules always, kind of thing. But if you can open that up, it also makes it into a medium of expression. But to get to there, you have to have the sense of how this is an organization, how this diagram is an organization. And I think that sense is the key.
Yes. Relies mostly on the definition of its operation, I think.
Yes, I think so. So thanks for that. And with that, I will press the recording off button and thank for the potential people, which are not actual people, but they might actualize themselves.